everyone. Welcome back to A Perspective. This is MJ speaking, and thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the podcast today. Thank you so much for coming back, you guys. If you are a regular listener who was back here for another week, welcome back. And if you are new here, welcome. My name is Mariana, and I am ecstatic to bring you today's conversation because it is on a topic that is very close to my heart, which is the topic of therapy and specifically accessibility to therapy. And this is a topic that I really don't think is spoken about enough, and one that I think really needs to have more light shed on, because the disparities in mental health care accessibility that exist in our system today are so huge, and we don't realize how negatively it is impacting the lives of people who truly need the service and who just want the service, frankly, because it isn't about needing it because you are at a last resort. It is about having access to a resource that you have a right to have, which is somebody that can help you and give you tools to put into your toolkit of coping mechanisms and resilience and endurance. And that really is what therapy is, and among many other things, of course, but there's so many negative stigmas that are also preventing people from having access to these resources that they need and deserve. And I wanted to bring light onto this conversation and speak with someone who is heavily involved in the field that can speak to these issues. So I am very excited to bring you this conversation this week that I had with Micheline Khan, who is the founder and CEO of Althea Therapy, which is an online digital platform that aims to provide mental health aid to Black individuals, Indigenous individuals, and people of color who are looking for mental health aid, and specifically a practitioner that meets their needs and is culturally competent, which is a term that we go into this conversation into, and which I'd never heard of before. So you can definitely look forward to that. And Micheline really is someone that I consider a true philanthropist and somebody who is contributing to radical change, and one that I think needs to be seen in society, and a cause that needs more light shed on so that more people can have access to mental health care that is suited for them and allows them to continue thriving in the way that is best for them. Before we get into the episode, I do want to take a second to respectfully acknowledge that this episode is being recorded on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Stalo, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, and Squamish First Nations communities, whose relationship with the land stands to this day, and on whose land I am an uninvited settler. And I am looking forward to continuing to bring conversation to the table about the disparities that impact these communities, especially on a topic such as this one, which is so needed right now. So without further ado, let's welcome Micheline onto the podcast. Hi, Micheline. Thank you so much for joining us. How's it going?
Thanks so much for having me. It's going really great. How about you?
Good, thank you. So just before we dive into the conversation, I just want to take a second to give you a little bit of a shout out and tell everybody that Micheline is dedicated to doing something absolutely phenomenal for the community and for society as a whole. So I'm super excited to dive into our conversation today. I think it's about a topic that isn't talked about enough and isn't acknowledged enough in society. So I'm ecstatic to have you on today. Before we get into the conversation, can you just take a second to tell us a little bit about your story and what you do, who you are, and why you do what you do?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the intro.
Totally.
So my name's Micheline Khan. I'm an ecologist by trade, so I focus on climate and biodiversity loss. And I'm the founder of Althea Therapy. It's a digital platform to connect with Black, Indigenous, and people of color mental health and wellness professionals in Canada. I maybe just to give a bit of an understanding of, my connection to mental health as an ecologist is, started from a very young age. Growing up in nature and outside is actually what kind of built the foundation for me in terms of mental health and prioritizing my mental health through my connection to nature. And so with the Althea Therapy app, you can find BIPOC mental health professionals and wellness professionals in a directory style service. And there's a mood journal, clinical definitions, resources, a peer support community, and so much more. And it's meant to be kind of this engagement hub for these communities to come and find necessary resources for health and wellness. And the mission is to kind of bridge the gap in digital mental health support for vulnerable groups across the country through access, visibility, and education. And I'm really excited to share it with you today.
That's incredible. Can I ask you how, because I feel like a lot of people listening probably wouldn't assume that you have a background in ecology. I certainly didn't expect that before you just told me that. So can you just give us a brief insight into how ecology and mental health are tied together in your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, and I feel like there's lots of research out there as well that talks about how time spent in nature impacts people's mental health and well-being. And I think oftentimes when you even ask people, where are they happiest most, people will actually say things like when I'm close to mountains or when I'm near water. And so oftentimes they mention the landscape. And so I think one of those things are really important to think about. And there's also so many positive chemicals from being outside and near trees and near plants that really help with your mental health and well-being and your state of calm. And there's so many different incredible things that you can improve your mental state by just being outside and going for walks. And it's also a place where you can stay active as well. And so a lot of people are just active in nature. And so that also helps with their physical and mental well-being. So there's so many different aspects there that I think contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to dive into that more and how that plays into how you've taken that and applied it to your own mental health and use it for others as well. But before we do that, I want to know if you always knew that you wanted to be a philanthropist and if you could tell us the story behind your organization. I'd love to know.
Thanks. I mean, I don't know if I would call myself a philanthropist, but I think I always wanted to do meaningful work. And I think, as an ecologist, a lot of the mission is about protecting and conserving nature, but connecting that with societal well-being as well, because they go hand in hand. It's not about taking away from the other. But I think working in that field, in the scientific field, I became a huge advocate, firstly for women in science. And so, witnessing the disparities and gender gaps there, I really started spending a lot of time advocating for women. And, before starting my business, I also grew up with, the parents that I have. My mother is a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I grew up really having mental health discussions about race and racism with both of my parents. And they were heavily involved in these spaces and in the communities, discussing these topics and teaching about it. My father's a teacher, and we just, that was the household that we grew up in. And so giving back to these communities was always a part of my family dynamic and a part of the way that we were raised. So I think all of that was always top of mind. But I think in terms of business, I never thought I would start a business. I had no interest in entrepreneurship. In fact, I think I felt bad for my friends who started their own businesses and over the years, because it seemed like their lives revolved around it. They had little time for anything else. And so I had no intention of ever doing that. But it was just kind of odd because I was always drawn to entrepreneurial content, like YouTubers or blogs and online courses. And I convinced myself that those were simply, transferable skills for my current job as an ecologist. And I thought, well, this will just help me, in my job. And it wasn't until I had built my, the first minimum viable product, the first stage of my app, that I realized I now had a business. And I think that's when all those doubts and fears come into play. But I think the important thing was actually refocusing the mission. So anytime that I had all these doubts and fears, it was to refocus the mission, and you know, it would shift kind of the mental state to more of excitement about finding new ways to help these communities cope with mental health issues. And I think that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's so interesting. And I really like that concept of like you can be you're not tied to your meaning, and your person isn't tied to one thing, right? Because I feel like a lot of people listening probably wouldn't associate somebody who is based in ecology as a background with an entrepreneurial mindset, right? But I think that that's such a powerful approach, because if you can have a little bit of, if you can have both in your toolkit of expertise, that's going to that's going to reach more people, and the impact is going to be so much greater, right? So one thing I want to ask you, just based off of what you were telling us about your story, is given the events of 2020, the uprise in the Black Lives Matter movement, and I feel like honestly the overall wokeness of the whole world, to just how prevalent and how alive the concepts of racial discrimination and inequity are still so alive in our society today. And I feel like we only really woke up to them this last year. As someone who grew up in a family where that was pretty normalized and it was a big priority for your parents, how did the uprising of this movement make you feel after all these years of fighting for it yourself, and now seeing people come alive to it and realize that it's a thing? What has that been like for you?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a loaded question and an important one. I think when the pandemic hit and, you started to see these huge increases in anti-Black racism, anti-Asian discrimination, all of that, it's a mix of emotions, because it's more than disappointment, but there's also, I think when you come from these communities, there's not so much shock because you have experienced it and witnessed it so much. I think part of the disappointment comes from other communities who act shocked, as if these things weren't happening for generations, that we didn't live with this type of racism and discrimination for our whole lives, and it's only now coming to the surface, because these are real issues that happen every day. Even seeing it with the Euro Cup, you see these constantly, and it's disappointing and it's tiring because you have to continually speak up. And I think that's the thing, that sometimes with people from these communities, you get tired of having to be that voice. But it's an important space, I think, to be in and to continue advocating for, and to continue speaking up and to calling these things out. And it takes a lot of, I think, strength to continue doing that. But, for anybody who's listening, I hope that you really do continue, because every time that one person speaks up, it's incredibly important, and could encourage others who witness that to continue speaking up. And it's a really tough time, because you see a little bit of progress and it's incredible. And then you see other things that take you 10 steps back. And, as you mentioned, even all of those things you were describing, just when the pandemic, it was one of the reasons why I even started this platform, was because I wanted to find a way to help these communities cope with the stress and anxiety and depression that they were feeling. Because it's not something that you can just like wish away. People really need the support and those services to cope. And, there's been so many barriers to them accessing these services over the years, that we need to find a better way to support these communities.
What do you think are some of those barriers that are preventing individuals from those communities specifically, make them want to access therapy?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, there's obviously the stigma and, the taboo that's associated with mental health, that spans across many communities, but particularly ones from the BIPOC community. There's cost. A lot of times therapy can be seen as like a luxury thing for people because many cannot afford it. There's access to culturally competent care, which is missing in a lot of fields. You know, when
Interesting.
you're coming into a space where you want to be vulnerable and explain how you're feeling and understand how you're feeling, you need somebody who understands your cultural context. And a lot of times that's really missing in these spaces. And another one, I think there's a ton of distrust in the system, which kind of attaches maybe to the stigma one, but there's a long history of oppression towards people of color in psychiatry and psychology. You know, we already know that there's profound inequities in BIPOC clients using mental health services and implicit bias. There's tons of studies on this, but there's also just an overrepresentation of Black and brown people admitted to psychiatric units. They're 4 times more likely to be admitted than white patients. And they're also more likely to be given medication than being offered counseling or psychotherapy. Wow. You know, and so there's this history that we need to address. And it's, you know, you're not going to just convince people to access these services if they're afraid of them. You know, they don't trust them. And that runs really deep. And sometimes it's difficult for people to pinpoint exactly what it is they distrust about it. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space.
Yeah, it's insane how, I mean, it is insane and it isn't insane how there still is so much inequity and so much distrust in the system, right? I think obviously it's one of those things that stems so deep. And even for me, as I'm studying for my MCAT exam right now to get into medical school. And so some of the, no, thank you. I haven't taken it yet, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But it's funny because some of so these exams are administered by the American College of Admissions, and the passages they give us for the psychology sections are about studies they've done on Black communities, Indigenous communities who have either a higher prevalence of disease but are less likely to get it. And it's so ironic to me that, you know, the organization that is responsible for the doctors of North America is showing us this information, yet it's still so alive. And it's like, okay, it's great that you're acknowledging it, but where is the accountability? Right?
Exactly.
So I don't think I've ever heard anybody use the term culturally competent in the setting of therapy and counseling. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is? That's really interesting.
Of course. Yeah, I think the simplest way to explain it is like seeking care that considers the role race and culture plays in our lives can be transformative. So when you're seeking care in these vulnerable spaces in healthcare and mental health, in these different institutions, you need somebody who understands the vastly different cultures, understands the intricacies of people's histories and how that applies to mental health. Because in therapy, what you often see is it's a very Eurocentric perspective about wellness, about how to take care of people. And that does not translate to other cultures. It does not always even help other cultures. It could actually make, symptoms worse. Or it also is, some of the reasons why they prescribe medication or they admit them to psychiatric units, because they do not understand, they don't have the cultural sensitivity to understand what these people are going through. And I think it's an extremely important space to be in when you're tasked with, people's lives, people's mental health. If you have the power and the authority to put somebody in a psychiatric unit, you need to be, very well educated, but also have that cultural competence and that anti-oppression and anti-racism training to make sure that you're making the right decisions and it's not informed by a lot of bias. So I think that's a really important thing that needs to be taught in a lot of these psychology courses and programs and schools. I hope that provides a good enough explanation.
No, that was perfect. And I think I totally agree. It's so difficult to, and I think that really ties into the distrust that you're talking about, right? It's like, well, if I'm someone of color and I go see someone who is maybe white per se, there's going to be it's going to be very difficult for them to relate to my circumstance, right? It's so much beyond understanding the definition of what oppression is and what microaggressions are and all these things that people from BIPOC, Indigenous, et cetera, communities face on a day-to-day basis. If you haven't experienced it yourself, it's very hard to empathize with that. So I completely understand and am so open to seeing how that is such a huge factor in the distress that we are experiencing in the system. So what would you tell somebody who is seeking therapy right now, but probably has that distrust? Where would you tell them to look, other than Althea Therapy, obviously, but where would you tell them to look, or how would you tell them to approach the situation to try to start fostering some sense of, hope and trust in the system?
Yeah, I think if it's somebody who is really seeking help, I think firstly it's identifying, what kind of services are you looking for? What do you need help with? And what kind of, what's important to you in anybody that you're going to? So some people, it might be gender. It might be that you're looking for a woman who can understand, the issues that you're going through. It might be age. Maybe you're looking for somebody a little older, younger. It also, might be ethnicity. So I think you have to identify what are the areas that are important to you, what is going to make you feel most comfortable to be vulnerable and to share a lot of the issues that you're going through. And then that's how you start to narrow down your search, so I think it comes down to what you feel you need, and then looking for that and starting at that space.
That's really good advice. I think that's so important, right? Like, obviously there's the added cost to it and stuff, but at the end of the day, it's your well-being. And I think that if you don't find somebody who is in your eyes suited for you, there's nothing wrong in going and seeking other people, right? At your organization, can you give us a little bit of insight into what you've given us a brief intro about what you do and such, but how do you work to match people with therapists that they would be ideally matched with? And how do you have cultural competency training in your organization, or is that a prerequisite for therapists?
Yeah. So one thing that I'll clarify too with Althea Therapy is, so firstly, I don't match people. I just provide a comprehensive directory, because what I've noticed is if I'm just matching you one-to-one, you lose the opportunity to see all of the different types of professions and different types of professionals that are out there, that you could make that choice, because maybe you wouldn't have been open to a holistic wellness professional until you saw somebody who looked like you and had that profile, or so firstly, that's why I chose to do more of a directory style instead of matching. And so the professionals that I bring on the app, so I don't hire these professionals. They have their own practices or are part of different clinics. What I do is I connect you to them. So many of them have anti-oppression or anti-racism training, or have specific like inclusion therapy and things like that. So there are ways to just filter for those things and to look for ones who specifically have those on the app. Yeah. And so it's just more meant to address kind of that visibility component of BIPOC professionals, because oftentimes the first thing I hear is, there aren't any, I can't find an Indian therapist, or I can't find a South Asian therapist. And so this directory addresses kind of that visibility component. You want to let the community know that these are all of the people that are out there.
Okay. So what kinds of aid is there? Because you said holistic wellness is one of them, and I feel like I don't know a lot outside of therapists and counselors, and now that extra one. So what kind of help is available that is more diverse than the traditional theory of therapists that we are all aware of?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of different ones. And just like you mentioned, holistic wellness, if you're looking at Indigenous therapists, what they actually do, they do so many different things. But one thing that I love is they bring this different aspect of healing and liberation, and it's healing circles, and it's really focusing on reconnecting with yourself. And so there's a few Indigenous counselors and therapists that I'm speaking to at the moment that are just incredible. There are also so cool. One thing that I find is kind of overlooked is actually healthcare professionals who have backgrounds in mental health as well. So I have two of them on our app as well, and they really focus on connecting like mind and body. And so that's also a really interesting thing for some people who maybe don't want to dive directly into, psychology and psychologists in sessions. And so there are different ways to go about this. And I think people need to be aware of just the diversity of support that's out there.
Yeah, totally. I think that's such an important point, because I think that we are all so used to this one definition of therapy, which is, you go and you talk about your problems and they give you like an exercise to take home, for example, right? But it's so much further beyond the traditional CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Which I think now people are waking up and realizing that it's not a functional or holistic approach to wellness and to psychological well-being, because it is so narrowly focused on one set of symptoms and guidelines. And you refer back to the DCM-5 or whatever, the manual, and it is so it's not open-eyed to the person, the individual, and their background and the different things that intersect to contribute to whatever they're going through. So I love that you are offering a diverse set of options for individuals to try and see, and to really define what wellness means to them, right? Because it might not be just, sitting in a therapist's office and talking about it. It might be, being open to, like you said, the natural healing of what an Indigenous therapist could bring or a counselor could bring. So I love that you're doing that. That's really, really cool.
Yeah. And there's one other, sorry, as you were talking, I realized there's another one where they do expressive arts therapy. So it's like expressing yourself, your emotions, honestly, through art, through poetry, through painting, and different ways. And so it's, I found that one really fascinating. And so there's just so many options out there for people.
Yeah, totally. So as someone who has been kind of exposed to all these different kinds of methods of therapy, counseling, healing, what is your kind of personal approach to wellness and mental health for you?
Yeah. For me, it's a combination of things. I definitely believe in speaking to professionals and getting the professional support that you need. But I also have always been, since I was young, always did kind of those gratitude practices and affirmations and like gratitude morning walks. And I think I did those things before I really knew what they were. And they're things that I continue till today, because it's what grounds me and sets my intentions for the day. It sets my mood for the day. And so I think having that combination of seeking that professional support, if that's what you need, and then also having your own habits and practices where you can dive deeper by yourself. And, whether that's even just journaling or painting. And I have so many friends who have different, really interesting ways of like doing introspection and reconnecting with themselves. And so for me, that's a really important thing that you need to do with yourself. And then adding on different layers to make sure that you are always checking in with yourself and making sure that you're okay. And so I completely recommend gratitude practices. People think that they're sometimes that they can't really have a huge impact. And for me, they're transformational. So I definitely think it's something that people should build a habit around.
What would you tell somebody who, so you mentioned, I see that you like really advocate for people seeking help, right? Which I love, because I think that there's this negative stigma, as we were talking about, that you should only seek help if there's like something absolutely wrong with you, right? Which is not true. I think that if you choose to make the decision to go forward and seek therapy, it's like the biggest sign of courage, right? Because you're choosing yourself and you're accepting that you might not have all the solutions, right? So what would you tell somebody who is debating getting help, but is like, am I qualified for this? Should I really be seeking help? Like, what would you tell somebody who's going through that?
I think I like to tell this story because I think it gives important perspective. Like when I was younger, I distinctly remember thinking therapy is good, but it's not for me. It's for people with real problems. Like you said, trauma-inducing problems. Then when I had real problems, I still thought, oh, but I'm strong. I can get through it on my own. I'll pray about it. And it wasn't until I went to my first therapy session, but with someone else as support, it was their session and they wanted me to be there with them, that I realized how valuable it was and how much I learned about myself and the choices that I make from sitting in on a session that wasn't even for me. So the way that I look at it is, if I want to prioritize myself and my own mental health and my well-being, my happiness, my joy, I need to put myself first. And if I'm going to put myself first, that means seeking out care that's going to help me. You know, not everything can be done on your own. You need a community, you need people to help you. And, you know, if you're going to go on battling on my own, I do everything on my own, I do everything. It's likely not true. There's so few people that are successful from literally doing it all by themselves. I don't think it's possible. So if you want to help yourself, get help.
It's that simple. I love that. Thank you for being such a voice in that, because I think so many people need to hear that, and so many people need to get the thumbs up and the validation that it's okay to not have it all figured out and to want to seek help, right? Because I think, like, people think so often that, like I said, it's a sign of weakness, when in reality you're just adding stuff to your toolkit, right?
Exactly.
So that's awesome. Thank you so much for being an advocate for that. We touched about this a little bit earlier, but what do you think are some of the biggest stigmas that are surrounding mental health aid right now that are preventing people from seeking it?
I mean, you know, BIPOC communities, because we're not homogenous, you know, each community has its own stigmas and taboos. And so I think, for instance, like some of them, it's a lot of communities, it's actually because it's seen as a weakness. And, you know, each one is slightly different. Each community looks at it slightly differently. For instance, you know, in the Black community, there's this like strong Black woman trope where it's like, no, you have to be strong. Black women are strong. You don't need help. You have to do things on your own. And very much seen as seeking out help is a bad thing. Asking for help is a bad thing. It's saying that you can't do it. You know, when, like you said, in reality, seeking out help is actually a sign of courage, because it shows that you're trying to get yourself together. You're trying to help yourself, and you can't help others until you've helped yourself. If you have a family of children, you have people who rely on you, how are you going to help them if you're not even taking care of yourself?
Yeah.
You know, and so, I mean, that's one thing, but there's, you know, in terms of it being seen as a weakness, there's also the taboos around it, mental illness, where people think you're crazy. And so they assume that as crazy, you know, you're not all there. And there's just this lack of knowledge around mental health and what that means. And so a lot of communities, again, don't seek help because they think like, well, I don't want my friends or family to think I'm crazy. They're, you know, they're gonna, again, it comes to the distress, throw me in an institution, all of these different things. And so those are, I think, the two main ones that we need to start addressing.
Yeah, that's huge. I feel like, you know, I advocate all the time, like, don't call anybody a spaz or a psycho, you know, just because they are seeking, because it's not, that's not what it is, right? It's just, it's this added thing to your being that might be more difficult for you, but really it makes you resilient in wanting to figure it out and to live with it alongside who you are, right? So I love that. So what can you tell us a little bit about your background and how that impacted your own mental health journey to where you are now, your background in terms of ethnicity, race, nationality?
Yeah. Well, my ethnicity, I'm Caribbean, so my parents are Trinidadian and Guyanese. But, you know, in those communities, a lot of Caribbean and African communities, again, mental health is very stigmatized. But I think I really lucked out with the parents and family that I have, in terms of, these were never taboo in my household. I never grew up feeling uncomfortable discussing, honestly, anything. I mentioned this earlier, but we've had many open discussions about race, about mental health, about anything that you would consider taboo. we've probably had the conversation about.
I love that.
And so, yeah, I was always raised to speak up about these things, to share my thoughts and feelings. And I feel like I was, you know, a child that was very nurtured. My parents nurtured me to express my feelings, to pursue goals that I didn't think that I could pursue. It was my father who has been my sounding board my entire life, the person that I share any and everything with, fears, frustrations, successes, joys, everything. And he's the one who encouraged me to move into this space, and to try out a business, and to try, you know, building tech that's going to help BIPOC communities and mental health. And so without, I think, having that supportive network and that tribe, that community that uplifts you, it's difficult to navigate these spaces and to have these conversations and to seek out help, you know. And I was very lucky to have parents, the parents that I have.
Yeah, I love that you explicitly kind of shouted at your dad in that, specifically because I feel like it's one of those things where dads are usually the ones that discourage it, just because they've grown up with the taming, right? That men don't show emotion, and then that translates over to their daughters, and then they tell their daughters, you know, don't be so sensitive and stuff. But I love that's such a beautiful example of how one person, you know, going off from that narrative and choosing to redefine to them what vulnerability means and what it means to be human has opened up space for others people to do the same, right? So he gave you that opportunity to speak your mind and to speak your feelings and to be emotional shamelessly, and now you're doing this incredible thing for so many people. So I love that you use him as an example, and I'm so glad that you had a figure like that in your life to give you that space.
And thank you for even saying that, because I agree, and I don't feel like they get enough attention, because I mean, I really attribute my success to both of my parents. You know, like, I named my app after my mom, but it's also my father who is the person who's helped me be who I am today. He's molded me in ways that I couldn't even imagine, and is the reason that I'm even comfortable being vocal about expressing myself. And yeah, I completely agree. I've never felt like I couldn't express my feelings or share my thoughts with him. And I'm eternally grateful for having a father figure like that in my life.
Totally.
Well, he is my father, not a father
figure. Yeah, absolutely. For someone who is struggling with vulnerability and opening up, right? I feel like that in itself is a taboo topic in our society, right? Like, you should be strong, and being strong means keeping stuff to yourself, right? And I think that has discouraged us from understanding and learning how to communicate ourselves. So if somebody you knew or somebody came to you and told you, you know, I'm really struggling with being vulnerable and opening up, what would be your advice to that person?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because it's something that I still struggle with today. You know, although I'm completely open with my family, with people outside of my family, it takes me a minute, more than a minute to do that. And it always comes down to myself, figuring out, well, why do I feel like I have to hide this? Or why do I feel like I have to be seen as strong? Or that things don't faze me, and all of those kinds of things that I really grew up with, because I really saw it as a negative to express my feelings, if they were what we considered negative feelings, being sad, crying, things like that, around people outside of my close friends and family. I wanted to be seen as strong, as somebody who was not fazed by those things. And it wasn't until I did a lot of self-reflection and introspection and journaling to actually track my thoughts and my feelings, that I realized that that's my own insecurities. This has nothing to do with being strong, because when I see people who open up about their problems and their issues and their fears, I see them as courageous. I see them as brave and strong, but why don't I attribute that to myself? And so the one thing that I would like to say to people like that is it's about you. It's not about how people view you. Because if you took that step to be vulnerable, everybody will look at you as courageous. You might have those one hater who will say something, but really, does their opinion matter to you that much? You really need to think of yourself. Like, how do you view yourself? If you can look at yourself and be proud of your vulnerabilities, of all of the things that you have accomplished in terms of even just sharing. What have you shared? What have you expressed? What are you hiding? And why are you hiding it? I think a lot of those questions are actually ones that you will figure out in therapy. And I think you shouldn't be ashamed of doing those things, because if you're looking at others who do that and you think that they're brave and you think, wow, imagine how much courage that took to speak out about this. Why is it you don't apply it to yourself? And so I think start with yourself first.
I love everything you said. And I think that that's so important too, that what you mentioned about reflecting your insecurities onto other people. And I think that it's so important to remember that when people discourage others from being emotional and open about who they are and their feelings and everything that is affecting them in that moment, a lot of times it's because people, like you said, are reflecting their insecurities onto them. And because it's something that is so strange and new to them, they're going to be really distraught or scared when they see it, right? So keeping that in mind, I think, is so important. So I love that you brought light onto that. That's incredible. One last question I want to ask you before we get into our speed round of questions is, where do you see Althea Therapy in 5-10 years? What's the mission with your organization?
Oh, wow. I mean, I love that question. And also, I mean, it's also one of those difficult questions, but our mission is to bridge the gap in digital mental health, to support vulnerable groups, through access, visibility, education, like I said, but it's ultimately to reduce mental health, racial disparities in mental health. So if I can even see a remote change in that, it would be fantastic. And I think just also on another level is expanding Althea Therapy across Canada and being more representative of all of the provinces and regions would be an incredible step as well in terms of providing support to these communities.
That's so important too. Like the idea that, I think when people set out to do a big goal like this, they want to change like everybody's lives, right? But I think you stating that, even if you see a small change, like a 1% increase, that's something.
Yeah.
Right. So I love that. And I'm really excited to see where this takes off, because I do think that this could help so many people. So thank you for everything that you're doing. It's incredible to see. Okay, so like I mentioned, you are a guest, and one thing I like to do with my guests is to ask them a rapid fire of 3 questions before I send them off for the interview. And what I do is I ask, the first 2 are uniform across all my episodes, but the very last one is different. I like to keep things interesting. So my first question is, what is your favorite quote?
Ooh, my favorite quote is, I don't want to butcher it, because I always, I can't ever remember the entire quote, but I have it here, so I'm going to pull it up. But it's by, Marianne Radmacher. So the quote is, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow."
I love that. And I love that the person who said it is so close to my name. So I love that. Thank you for sharing. The second question is, what song is currently stuck in your head?
Ooh, that's tough, because like 12 of them came to mind.
Oh.
But I would probably just say any Burna Boy song is stuck in my mind.
Oh, very nice. Do you know his song with Georgia Smith?
Yes.
Is it? Oh my God. I
forget what it's called, but I know it. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it? It's not. Be Honest. I'm pretty sure is what it's called. Oh, love that song. Georgia Smith, and such a good combo of voices. I love that. And the last question is, what does mental health mean to you?
Ooh, mental health. To me, it means being able to, it's when you have setbacks in life, being able to adjust to the setbacks in terms of care and how you deal with how you deal with these challenges in life. So it's looking, for me, it really is about looking at how you respond to challenges, how you respond to difficulty, how you respond to different emotions that cause people to sometimes, spiral, whether it's shame, anger, hate. How do you respond? And so that's kind of how I look at that. If you're responding and coping with stress in healthy ways, is how I look at it.
Mm-hmm. To respond and to react to two different things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much for that conversation. That was so profound, and I hope that the people listening took something away from that and are less reluctant to seek help in the future after hearing someone in the profession validate just how necessary it is for you to seek help and how useful it is to just get a second opinion if you can get it. So thank you again for everything that you're doing and for all the contribution that you're making to society and the community at large. Where can people find you after this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really appreciate you making the space for it.
Mm-hmm.
People can find me whether it's on Instagram, so it's at Althea Therapy. It's ALTHEA Therapy. You can also go on our website, which is www.altheatherapy.com.
Perfect. I will link all that in the description so people can find you. And yeah, thank you so much again, Micheline. I am so excited to see what you do in the future. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey everyone, welcome back to A Perspective. This is MJ speaking, and thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the podcast today.